People at home, give me a heads up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Great. Okay. For those of you who are in class, it's important to remember that after Thanksgiving, everything is online. So don't come here after Thanksgiving. You'll have to Zoom everything. So everything will be on Zoom starting Monday after Thanksgiving. The final is in person here. But the administration has decreed that they don't trust y'all coming back from Thanksgiving holidays. They think you're going to infect everybody. So they're going to make you not come back to live class. So I will see your smiling faces on Monday, but after that, not until the final. So be sure to make use of the time we've got and get your questions answered. Remember that if you like what your grade is after the 4th exam, that will be your final grade. Okay, I will set the final grade scale after that 4th exam, which is why we really cannot afford to have a lot of late makeups. So everything's happening before Thanksgiving. You get the final grade scale and you know whether or not to take the final exam. And if you like where you are, if all you're gunning for in this class is a C and you've got a C, you don't have to take the final exam because you get a C. That will be your final grade. So your final exam will be the one you drop. On the other hand, if you need to come up, if you're below a grade cutoff or something, then by all means, come and take the final exam. And I'll talk more about the structure of the final exam when we get closer to it. Now, today, before we get started, I would just want to mention a couple of things. First, this lecture is not on exam 4. This lecture will be covered on the final exam. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing is the structure of exam 4. Okay, I've decided that there are some really good short answer type questions that we can ask of this material. And that means that I'm going to cut the number of multiple choice down to 10, make them 5 points each, and have 5 responsive questions. There will be a calculation, all right? And so you'll need to bring your calculator. That calculator must do natural logarithms. Okay, there's always a question about diversity on this exam. So be sure that you bring a calculator that does natural logs with you for the exam on Monday. So the exam starts with mutualism. We have 2 lectures on mutualism, and then we have a series of lectures on communities, just basic communities, food webs, succession, diversity, biogeography, landscapes. So that's the material that will be on exam 4. This lecture is not on exam 4. And although you may be here for this lecture, you may not have to take an exam on it if you elect not to take the final. Okay, so you will know your exact standing in the class by the time that exam 4 is graded, and you can decide how best to spend your time, either preparing for the final or deciding, I don't need that. All right. So from home, anybody got anything?
You said there was going to be 5 short answers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. One of them will be a calculation. The other 4 will be the kind of short answers that you've been getting. And you may have to draw some things. You may have to interpret a graph, right? because we've still had graphs. We've had graphs in biogeography, right? So, you know, there's still some things that you will have to do, but they're going to be just one calculation problem, and the other four will be short answer problems. So I'm going to share this now. And okay, all right. Well, how about that? All right, so today we're going to talk about the larger scale patterns of biodiversity that we see on Earth. What we talked about before was community level diversity patterns. And they're regulated either by biotic interactions or by local environment characteristics of some kind, the abiotic factors, like heterogeneity, resource availability, and disturbance. Or they are communities that are kind of assembled randomly through biogeographic patterns, right? And biogeographic patterns make kind of no particular assumptions about interactions between species. They just sort of focus on like the sheer number of species and don't really get into whether or not they interact. It's a little bit more complicated than I just presented it, but basically that's kind of it. So today we're going to look at the larger scale patterns of biodiversity, and that's the pole to equator diversity gradient. So y'all know that there are a lot of species in the tropics at the equator, and there are not that many species in the poles. And what processes explain this? Now, the first thing we'll ask is whether large-scale diversity patterns like these are consistent with the 6 hypotheses that we have advanced to explain the small-scale patterns. The 3 types of ways that organisms can interact with each other by greater specialization or greater niche overlap, or by being able to exploit a larger niche space versus rates of disturbance, kinds of heterogeneity in the environment, and resource availability. So do these large scale patterns from pole to equator, are they well explained by those things? We'll talk about scale dependence of the processes that regulate diversity and explain why these aren't that great. And then we'll look at some of the large scale processes that might affect global diversity on a global, continental or global scale, and talk about them. And there are 3 in particular that are really important because they have high explanatory power. The first is area. The second is the favorableness, quote unquote, of the environment. That can take different forms in different parts of the Earth. And then finally, there's this just huge effect of history. And local diversity patterns, say in a lizard community in one valley versus another, have very, very little to do with the history of those communities because they generally share the same history. At a global scale, however, that's not necessarily true. So we'll explain what the patterns are, how they do or do not fit with the existing hypotheses, and then move on to look at some really powerful hypotheses. So here's an example of what we're trying to explain. So here's the pole to equator diversity gradient for a couple of taxa. So on the left, here's the number of plant species. And here's the equator on the y-axis, that's 0 degrees latitude. Okay, and here's roughly 60 degrees north. And you see that there are only a couple of hundred species when you get that far north. Really, there's no landmass at that latitude in the south. That is the southern circumpolar ocean in the south. So that is an area of complete ocean, the ocean that surrounds Antarctica. So this is like Siberia, northern Canada, Alaska. And there just aren't that many species there. This is a standard linear scale. So you look at that and it's probably about 500 species or so, compared to at least 5,000 and possibly up to 10,000 species at the equator. So plants show a very, very, very strong pole to equator gradient of diversity, far more diversity at the equator. Here's a second, and this is bird species, and here you see a really tight relationship. Now, this is bird species, and this is standardized to, I don't know what unit. I think this is maybe what, 10,000 kilometers, square kilometers? I can't remember. But there's certainly more than 1,000 bird species in the equatorial regions. And so I think that this is standardized to a unit of area, which they sort of don't give us. But you'll see that this is the equator once again on the y-axis. And here's, oh, actually I see it's a log scale this time. I was thinking it was still linear scale. So yeah, it's a log scale. So that's about right. About 3,000 bird species are found in the equatorial regions, and not a whole lot in the high latitudes. What are these birds doing here? Well, mostly they're nesting. Mostly they don't stay. There's only 1 or 2 species that really stays year-round in northern Canada or Siberia. The rest are migratory, and there are not that many of them. There's only maybe 50 species that go to the really high latitudes to do this. So, a couple of really good examples of this strong pole to equator diversity gradient. Now, let's ask whether our local community diversity processes fit well with what's going on here. The answer is no, for a couple of reasons. For one thing, when you say the tropics, quote unquote, or the polar zones, you are talking about areas so large that there's no expectation that the species will actually interact. So a lot of these biotic equilibrium hypotheses really would not apply. I mean, if sandhill cranes in Alaska don't interact with willow ptarmigan in Norway, then how can these biotic factors here, specialization, niche space, and niche overlap, play any role? There's much less interaction among species at large global scales. And so the biotic factors, the equilibrium hypotheses, almost by definition, would have very little explanatory power. We can go a little further and analyze whether there's more niche space in the poles versus the equators. Well, it's a little hard to determine, and it kind of depends on how you define it. Looks like, yeah, there might be more niche space in the tropics, but then again, niche space in the tropics is packed into a much smaller area. And so if you look at the entire taiga, even though there may be fewer niches, there's this huge space. And so who's to really say whether niche space consistently is greater in the tropics or not. It's scale dependent. And scale of niche space is really arguable. And we just have found that niche space is just not a particularly compelling explanation. What about niche overlap? Well, as it turns out, you cannot, in our studies of, say, temperate and tropical and polar organisms, find consistent patterns in which tropical species have greater overlap. They don't. So they tend to be just as spaced out along the niche space that is available as any other species. So that one's out the window. What about specialization? There is actually no evidence to suggest that tropical species are more specialized. They have a more limited geographical range because their niche conditions are more fragmented in the tropical zone. And polar organisms in particular have a very wide geographic range because their niche conditions are found all over the place. But that doesn't mean that tropical organisms are more specialized. They just aren't. There's no consistent pattern here. What about resource availability? Again, we've looked at, say, things like soil nutrient availability. We found absolutely no consistent patterns. There's some areas of the tropics that are extremely rich in particular nutrients, and some that are relatively poor in the polar zones. That would tend to suggest that polar zones might have more species, because as you know, increasing availability of a single nutrient favors the weeds. And yet, there's no consistent pattern. Environmental complexity or heterogeneity, very, very hard to establish meaningful comparisons of this, and we just have not found that there's a particular pattern. And finally, disturbance. This would suggest that the poles are either much more disturbed or much less disturbed than the tropics. And that's just not true. We have disturbances of all scales, frequencies, and sizes that occur in the tropics. And we see similar patterns in the poles. So none of the small scale explanations is really that satisfactory in talking about the pole to equator diversity gradient. So what regulates the number of species on very, very large spatial scales? Well, it would be anything that would affect the speciation rate and the persistence of species. So anything that affects speciation or extinction over large areas is probably more related to the pole to equator gradient than our local diversity hypotheses. Okay, well, the one pattern that is so very clearly related to rates of extinction and rates of speciation is area. Larger areas have greater rates of speciation. And that is because the larger the area that a species can inhabit, the more likely it is that there will be small peripheral isolated populations. And if you'll recall from 2014, that's how you get allopatric speciation. So there's more opportunities for allopatric speciation in large geographical areas. And that would suggest that areas with greater diversity ought to be large. Large areas also have lower extinction rates for the simple fact that the larger the area, the larger the population it can support. We know that large populations have a lower extinction probability than small areas, or small populations rather. Okay, so this is the first of the three hypotheses that we're going to talk about for the global pattern. It's area. The other two are favorable climate and historical accident. We'll talk a bit more about them. Now, what this would suggest, if we turn our attention to area first, what this would suggest is that if the tropics have more species, there should be a lot more area in the tropics than in the poles. Is that true? You're shaking your head. The answer is yes, absolutely. It is absolutely true. This up here is the Mercator projection that we're used to looking at in grade school, displaying the Earth, right? And look here, Greenland is almost the same size as South America. Well, that's not true. Greenland is way smaller than South America. But because the Mercator projection stretches out the polar regions, it makes it look artificially large. Siberia here looks enormous. In fact, it's pretty large, but it ain't anywhere near this large. Siberia is much smaller than it appears on the Mercator projection. Now, geographers have long realized that this is a problem in presenting area to lay people, because people just make the assumption, oh, well, Australia is about the same size as all of Southern Africa. That is just not true. And India is tiny compared to Australia. That is absolutely false. Okay, so they've tried other kinds of projections to make areas more realistic. Here's the Goody projection, which is a lot better. For one thing, it makes South America and Africa in particular look about the way that they actually look when you look at them on the globe from space. Africa is somewhat bigger. South America, though, is quite large. And it's a different relationship than you see here in the Mercator projection. In Mercator, the area of South America is stretched out so that it looks closer to the area of Africa, and in fact, it's kind of not. The area of Canada is way more accurately represented in the Goody projection. And look, Canada is not, as it appears here in the Mercator projection, 3 times the size of the continental US. It is larger than the continental US, but not 3 times as large. And now Siberia has shrunk down to its more appropriate size. Okay, but even this has some distortions. And so I'm going to show you another projection that is an equal area projection. The Peters projection is equal area. That means that this box here is the same as this box here. And notice that now Canada is only slightly bigger than the continental US here. That's good. South America and Africa are kind of stretched out in this equal area projection, but the areas are accurately conveyed relatively. And now you can see that Australia is in fact not as big as the entire south half of Africa. It's only as big as about the southern third of Africa. India is much more realistically portrayed, and one of the big changes here is how little area Siberia occupies compared to the rest of Asia. So our perception of the area of habitats on Earth is skewed by the way that we have tended to view them, especially in elementary school. And so when we look at the actual measured geographic area of, say, tropical, subtropical, temperate, cold temperate, and Arctic areas, what do we see? The tropics are by far the largest land area on Earth. Here's the northern hemisphere on the right. And you see you have about the same amount of subtropical, temperate, cold temperate, boreal, and Arctic. Over here on the left is the southern hemisphere. Remember, there's very little land area in the southern hemisphere. Most of the land area in the southern hemisphere is subtropical. So the greatest area, on Earth is actually in the tropics. Greatest land area. Second greatest land area is subtropical. Third greatest is temperate. Fourth greatest is boreal, and fifth greatest is Arctic. When you actually measure the number of hectares in these types of habitats, area is almost one-to-one correlated with the diversity of any taxa you could name. I could actually name one taxa that is not, and that's parasitic wasps. In let's see which family is it? It's the I can't remember the family, but one family of parasitic wasps has a diversity peak in the mid latitudes, kind of the temperate zone and subtropics, and then it falls off again in the tropics. We don't know why that is. It could actually just be sampling error. We may just not have reared all the parasitic wasps out of caterpillars in the tropics that there are. But that's the only exception that I can think of. Area is by far the single best predictor of diversity on a global scale. And if you go down from the global scale to large land areas, continents and regions, area is still a darn good predictor of diversity. So here are the continents and major islands. And here is the diversity of terrestrial mammals. And here you see that the diversity of terrestrial mammals is highest in Eurasia, and that is the highest land area. Africa and South America are nearly equal in area, and they are virtually equal in number of terrestrial mammals. North America is somewhat smaller here, number of land mammals, but not that far off. Australia is much, much more depauperate and has a much smaller area. New Guinea, the world's largest island, has a much smaller area and many fewer mammal species, and so does Madagascar, an even smaller major island. Area does a really good job of explaining diversity at the global scale and at the continental scale. So here is an attempt to apply area to the biomes that we covered earlier and ask whether large biomes, say within a continent, might have a relationship between area and the number of species that they support. And so on the left is vertebrates. These are fruit-eating vertebrates. We have a gazillion graphs like this. This one is just a particularly useful one because it shows the pattern really well. And so here's the angiosperms on this line, and here's the number of angiosperms, and notice it's a log axis. And so here is rainforest area. Okay, so the area of rainforest that we find on Earth, is that related to the number of plant species we find in that area of rainforest? And it absolutely is. This is South America. It is by far the largest area of rainforest on Earth. This is South Asia, the second largest. This is Africa, the third largest. And this is, I believe, New Guinea. Okay, and the number of plant species follows a really strong relationship here. Okay, the same relationship holds for organisms that, let's say, vertebrates that eat the fruit of those plants, and that's this top curve here. So there are several hundred of those in the forests of South America. There are a few hundred, this is probably about 200 species, in the forests of Indonesia and South Asia. Here's Africa, right? Here's some of the smaller islands, tropical islands that have tropical vegetation. So within a biome, a widely distributed biome, area is also an extremely powerful predictor of species richness. Okay, what's the reason we're using rainforest? Remember, the tropics are the largest land area. That means that rainforest is actually a really large biome. And so we're likely to see these patterns very clearly if we look at rainforest area. All right, now let's turn our attention to the second idea, which is how favorable the environment is. Okay, what do we mean by favorable? One of the problems with this particular idea is that many people have, used different ideas about what makes an environment favorable. And some people focus on, say, the range of temperatures. Like if it's a narrow range of temperatures, that's easy to adapt to. If the range of temperatures is really wide, that makes it hard to adapt to because you have to be able to function in both warm and cold conditions. So some people use temperature as a proxy for sort of how favorable an environment should be. And here is a presentation of an analysis that focuses on, say, mean annual temperature. And so here's mean annual temperature. It's not the variability, but it's mean annual temperature, and it's about the same for a very wide area of the tropics. And then it starts to decrease kind of at a constant rate as you go north. Okay, so why would temperature in particular be related in this way to an environment being favorable? Remember that one of the things that is required for life is photosynthesis. Okay. Constant temperatures means a constant set of conditions all year round, providing the opportunity for plants to photosynthesize year round. As you get towards colder conditions, you get more and more seasonality, and that means that photosynthesis can only occur during part of the year. So basically photosynthesis drops and it follows this temperature curve. All right. So the other thing is that remember that the tropics are the largest land area, and look at how constant the temperatures are in that large land area. If you're adapted to one area of the tropics, you can go pretty much anywhere in the entire huge range of tropical habitats because the temperatures that you will experience is going to be about the same. Contrast that with, say, a more temperate environment down here. Let's say you are adapted to about 5 degrees centigrade as an annual average. That doesn't mean it's 5 degrees all year round. It means that it's probably about 70 or 80 degrees during the summer, and it could be freezing in the winter. Well, if that's your range of adaptation, look at how narrow the window is for you to go either north or south. Because if you go south, or if you go towards the equator, look, it quickly gets much warmer, and some of your adaptations to cold climates won't work. So for at least part of the year, you'll be very poorly adapted. And you won't have high fitness because of that. Again, if you go towards the poles, the temperature quickly drops. And what that means is that the physiological mechanisms you have to tolerate warm temperatures are useless. They're simply taking energy from you and not helping you cope with the environment anymore. So not only do the tropics have the largest land area, they have the most constant climate. Okay, so physiologically, so for a couple of reasons, this makes it seem that favorableness is a reasonable explanation. Physiologically, organisms that are adapted to tropical conditions are adapted to virtually the entire geographical range of the tropics. Those that are adapted to temperate or boreal conditions are adapted to only a narrow band of environment. So they have less land area. All right, let's examine a little more closely how energy might affect favorableness and species richness. So here is here's an analysis of vertebrates related to the ability of plants to photosynthesize. Okay, so as that goes up, so does diversity, sort of up to a point. Okay, so more food means more species. Well, I think that everybody would agree that more food is a more favorable environment. Now, it doesn't keep going up, and that's probably because there will be limits to how many species you can support in really rich environments, because the more you subdivide the energy, the smaller your populations, and eventually there will be an equilibrium between extinction of smaller and smaller populations and speciation rate of new populations. So I don't think anybody really expects these curves to keep going up indefinitely. And that's probably why we probably reach an equilibrium between the extinction of smaller and smaller populations as richness increases and the origin of new populations. Now, what makes an environment favorable is complicated. And remember that one of the major complications on Earth is that there's way more land area in the northern hemisphere, way more ocean area in the southern hemisphere. Not surprisingly, species richness is correlated with different things. Interestingly, species richness is most highly correlated with energy. That's the red bar here. And so this is the number of studies that include these bands. And these 19 studies found that primary production at this latitudinal band is most strongly correlated with richness. Okay, it drops as you go towards the equator because area kind of takes over from favorableness. But here, food supply in the northern hemisphere is pretty important. So this is temperature. Why is it temperature? Because these are land plants. And they can only photosynthesize when it's above freezing. So mean annual temperature is related then to energy production, and energy production is what limits terrestrial organisms mostly. In the southern hemisphere, it switches. It's moisture availability. Why is moisture availability more important in the southern hemisphere? Well, think about the small land area in the southern hemisphere. if you think about where that land area is, it's often at latitudes where rain shadow deserts occur. There's a rain shadow desert in the mid latitudes in South America along the Pacific coast. There's a rain shadow desert in mid latitudes in Africa along the Atlantic coast. Most of Australia is a rain shadow desert. So moisture availability is actually a more powerful influence on species richness in the Southern Hemisphere than temperature. Temperature along that belt is not that different, but moisture availability is. Okay, now we can combine energy and moisture to understand continental-wide patterns of diversity. And some groups are going to be more sensitive to temperature, some will be more sensitive to moisture, and some will be sensitive to the combination. So here's trees in North America, and we know that there's a rainfall gradient from east to west. This is dry, this is moist, this is warm, this is cool. So look, you have a real peak in diversity in the warm, wet area of the Southeast. Okay, temperature drops as you go north, and so does the number of species, but rainfall also drops as you go west, and this number of species also drops towards the west. So trees respond to a combination of both temperature and moisture. Same is true of amphibians. Of course, amphibians need water to reproduce, so that's pretty reasonable. Reptiles, on the other hand, are adapted to reproducing on dry land. They respond almost exclusively to the temperature gradient. There are 70 species here, but there are 80 species here, 80 species here. Reptiles decrease from south to north in response to temperature change. So some groups of organisms respond to temperature mostly, some respond to moisture mostly, and some respond to a combination. It's really easy to see in North America because it's wet on the east, dry in the west, warm in the south, cool in the north. And so you can see whether the diversity gradient is going straight north in response to temperature, straight east-west in response to rainfall, or kind of at a 45-degree angle in response to both temperature and moisture, which is what amphibians and trees are doing. Okay, lastly, what about history? We said that history has consequences. And here's an example of a big influence of the history of big geographical areas and how their current species richness is tied to their long geologic history. So here we have 3 areas of Mediterranean vegetation. Okay. The Cape region of South Africa, Southwest Australia, and California. So the Cape region underwent this massive era of mountain building about 20 million years ago and resulted in a topographically really diverse area. The Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa go up to about 9,000 feet. And they provide a lot of extra niches for Mediterranean plants, that is, those that are adapted to summer drought and winter rain to exist. Southwestern Australia is flat, flat, flat. It's been flat, flat, flat for about 1 billion years. The last mountains there were worn down about 1 billion years ago. Okay, and in California, there's a north-south valley, north-south mountains. So let's think about what the consequences are. When you have cold periods, that isolates species in the lower elevations. You're going to get more isolation in the Cape region because it's more mountainous. There are more little valleys in which isolated peripheral populations can speciate. Southwest Australia, not so much. The entire area is going to be affected by the same conditions. And in California, you'll get north-south shifts during cold and warm periods. And that doesn't really provide as much opportunity for speciation as you find in the Cape region of South Africa. Okay, so greater speciation because of greater topographic diversity here. Okay, a second instance is right here. This is temperate forest diversity. Okay, so here are 3 areas of temperate forest on the face of the Earth. Here's the number of species in Europe's deciduous forests, in East Asia's forests, and in Eastern North America's forests. Okay. Notice that East Asia has the highest diversity. Okay. Europe has the lowest. North America is in between. What's going on? Think once again of glacial cycles, alternating cold and warm periods. During cold periods, species are forced toward the equator. During warm periods, they expand toward the poles. In China, they are free to do that because there are relatively few geographic barriers to dispersal. So it's a diverse, topographically diverse area that has few high mountain ranges that would cause barriers to disperse. So lots of species originations and not many climate-driven extinctions. China can have high speciation rates and relatively low extinction rates. In North America, you have north-south mountains, the Rockies. But you also have these forests isolated on the East Coast from everything else. In Europe, you have forests in the north and forests in the south, and what's in between? The east-west Alps. They cause repeated extinctions of deciduous forest trees that are not able to disperse south to escape glacial conditions. So yeah, they can originate in Europe, but they have a very high extinction rate due to glacial extinctions. Okay, over here, this shows you the number of taxa that we have identified in the fossil record versus the number that we know are alive today. And Europe has a much higher number of extinctions than either Asia or Eastern North America. Okay. That's because of the glacial patterns forcing these species extinct against the east-west running Alps. Now you might ask, well, okay, so Asia doesn't have a lot of barriers to north-south dispersal. Eastern North America doesn't either. Why is North America less diverse? Number one, smaller land area. Number two, many North American species originated from Asian forests. So there's a dispersal barrier. If China is the center of the deciduous forest diversity and it supplies species to Europe and America, America is by far the most isolated. It's harder for those species to disperse to America. They can disperse to Europe, but the glaciers will periodically cause them to go extinct. So just geographically, the history of these 3 areas is quite different. Europe has lots of extinctions because of the east-west trending Alps. China and North America do not. But North America also has lower diversity because most deciduous forest species originated in Asia, and it's just further away from Asia than Europe. And it's hard for those species to get to North America. So we've had 3 an exploration of 3 ideas: area, favorableness, and history. History has consequences. Area is by far the most influential in the polar to equator gradient. Favorableness plays a role, and you can see that on a continental level. One of the most interesting things that we've showed you today is this, that shows that favorableness in the temperate areas is related to diversity, but not so much in the tropics, because area takes over as a more influential thing here. So area is more important here than environmental favorableness. But in the higher latitudes, environmental favorableness is important. And then finally, history. Okay, that's all we've got for today. And I'll take any questions that you have either in class or at home. Let's see if we can exit this. Okay. All right, so work hard this weekend. You're not responsible for this lecture on Monday's exam. Make sure you get your questions answered. If you can't find me, email me. Got it? See a lot of nodding here in class. I hope there's some nodding at home. Anybody at home got a question before we sign off? All righty then, bring your calculators on Monday, and we'll see you one last time in person before the final. Have a good weekend.